Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Molly Jahn, Professor, University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Hello. It's my great pleasure to bring to you your last keynote talk on technology and food security. But before I start, I want to acknowledge all the heroes and heroines in this audience. This is a special audience for me because I've worked with many of you, and there are many of you I don't know. But those assembled with whom I have worked have not yet worked with each other. And that is a key point that I'd like to make in this keynote address. Because when we break open the power that's in this room, beyond where you all have taken this conversation into this next century, where food is at the center of every important conversation I know, I can't wait to see what's going to happen next. So I'd like to start with a treatment of the word technology. This is a loaded word. It's a really important word. It is a word that actually defines our species, because hominids are known for use of technology and social complexity. And I'm actually going to talk about innovations that are relevant for achieving food security and, furthermore, food systems that meet our needs and wants, using innovations in both those areas, technology and innovations in social systems. So technology is the systematic application of arts and crafts. It's practical. It's not necessarily a gizmo. It's not necessarily any particular category of innovation. But it is the systematic application of our insights, our cleverness, to the problems in front of us. And so this is a really important word for us looking forward in this century, because I'm going to argue that we have not yet clearly brought into sight the challenges related to our food systems. And therefore, the application, the systematic application of arts and crafts related to food systems is just at the very beginning. So speaking of the beginning, I had the privilege of serving as dean of one of America's great land-grant colleges at the University of Wisconsin. There are a couple of sitting deans in the audience. Hats off to you. And this is a mural taken from the college I come from, where we had an artist in residence in the 1930s. This is a John Steuart Curry mural in one of our buildings depicting farm life in the early part of the 20th century. Now, those distinguished-looking gentlemen overlooking the scene are my relatives, my double great-grandfather William Saunders and his son Charles. Charles wanted to be a musician and a poet, but his father made him be a plant breeder. And in Canada, where they lived in the later part of the 19th century, they approached the task before them, which happened to be breeding a short-season, hard red winter wheat for the western plains of Canada. And they did. They were stunningly successful in innovating, using genetic resources, our patrimony, to open up a part of the world for settlement that had not previously been habitable for our kind, at least not in the kinds of numbers that now live there. And so, in part, my ancestors and some of yours made possible another characteristic of our species, which is we are among the most successful and certainly the highest impact invasive species in the world. Inspired by their example, although I've learned a thing or two in the last 20 or 30 years, I also became a plant breeder and innovated into this system. As a consequence of these innovations, you heard Dan last night stress the importance of innovations with respect to crop varieties and livestock breeds, but also innovations in many other ways. Our farms don't look like this anymore. They've changed. Have they changed for the better or the worse? That's a different conversation. but they've changed. They've changed in really significant and important ways. And I, as a plant breeder, have learned a thing or two as I lobbed my innovations out into food systems all around the world and right close to home, including Stone Barn, where a number of our vegetable varieties, which we were early on in selecting in organic environments, have been grown. But I also have produced varieties grown commercially on very large scales and for subsistence all over the world. And as I watched what happened to those varieties, I began to be really interested in ways in which technological innovations affected the outcomes that I told you as a plant breeder I intended to affect. When I was in training in the early 1980s, mid-1980s, I was told, yield, yield, yield. Molly, that's all you need to know. That's it. That takes care of everything. Well, we've learned a thing or two. Yield is really important. Gains in productivity have changed the face of this earth, changed our species. Huge increases in population, obviously, huge increases in the condition, in health and many other attributes, and a world that would be unrecognizable to our forefathers. Innovating with a specific, strict focus on system components and maximizing local productivity, local yields of an individual system component has given us a lot more of that system component. And those innovations have driven a food system that is a complex network that binds us together as a planet and binds us to our planet. But I was assigned to cover the role of technology and food security. And I have to note that that word secure, we're not there. 1 billion people hungry, 1 billion or more overweight. Everywhere around the world, obesity is considered a significant threat to any of the outcomes we would hope for and that we aimed for with these gains in productivity. So, furthermore, food sufficiency, doesn't equal food security. And it's really an exciting time, and it's great to have those of you who are interested in health and diet in this audience thinking about agriculture with us and thinking about the way food systems deliver on our diets with us. Because that word secure, we've got a lot to learn about what that word means. And there's not a magic answer out there. It's going to be a negotiated word. It's a negotiated definition. And I'm going to suggest emphatically that this is a frontier in terms of understanding what we mean by food secure. And furthermore, to tell the truth about the strategies that have created this incredible abundance of food, but a series of dynamics on a scale that we couldn't have imagined, even at the beginning of my career. Water has been mentioned. We can't talk about food without water resources. The red spots on this map are places where groundwater is dangerously low in a part of the world we depend on for that productivity. We have, as I say, human health effects that are creating enormous consequences in a host of directions and tremendous costs, and are symptomatic of the dynamic that unites many of the symptoms that bring each of you into this room. And that is, we have binged wildly on energy moving through our food systems. And so I'm going to take a minute to talk a little bit about the ways in which technology have both influenced that binge and can be influential in addressing both the symptoms and the alternatives. And I'm going to pick on two aspects of technology in the 21st century. I'm going to pick on technologies that open up transparency. We heard a lot about transparency this morning. It's an incredibly exciting frontier. You heard pretty much every panel talk about the power of transparency. You heard our colleagues in the first panel committed to transparency. Transparency is an incredibly significant enabling force in humankind. And I'm also going to talk about soil. So this word efficiency, and I appreciated the discussion this morning, efficiency has a numerator and a denominator. That we can agree on. And under that lens, that guise of efficiency in 20th century food systems, we have stretched systems to an edge where we are dependent on certain categories of resources where we can easily see, this is not rocket science, to see when those resources are gone, the system crashes. And we're going to be lucky in some cases if we get the warning of scarcity, because what we know about systems is they tend to collapse. They tend to move radically back and forth across a threshold, and then they collapse. And furthermore, this binge on energy, on top of having consequences for human health, for water, for soil, has had tremendous consequences on our climate and extreme weather. Our approaches, especially the addition of exogenous energy in the form of nutrients, has changed the way our soils work and has created a leakiness to our soils that have literally turned nutrients to toxins in parts of the world. Now, I'm showing you a picture. This is a picture that connects things we didn't know were connected for a long time. So now our actions in one place and time can be connected to consequences at other places and times. And now we can have the conversation. So adding fertilizer to a soil in a big lump is sort of like ordering all the pizzas you're going to eat all year on the same day. The happiest person in the room is the person that sells you the pizza. But this kind of uneven addition of nutrients has had huge consequences for the way our soils work. And we heard wonderful discussion this morning about the ways in which alternative paradigms of soil management show tremendous promise, not only for stabilizing yields, not only for reducing consequences of extreme events, but also for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm quite sure that FDR was right, and that the way we take care of our soil is indicative of the way we care for ourselves. This slide reminds me to mention the importance of a number of existing investments in technology and in infrastructure in the land-grant university system, in the US Department of Agriculture. This is a slide I got from one of the many heroes in the Natural Resources Conservation Service, focusing on soil health, building the methodologies to describe it, and moving us away from too many pizzas all on one day. As a consequence of a lot of our management choices, we have ended up with systems that are extremely vulnerable to extreme events. At this time, there is not a single place in our government where we keep track of extreme events relevant to agriculture. And so you may have noticed on my initial slide, there was a logo of a national laboratory, a premier basic science laboratory focused on energy, because the consequences of weather and climate are so significant in agriculture, and agriculture is so significant to those consequences. We're now seeing the potential for relationships across our governments and across lots of different kinds of communities we never have had before. So the point is, we have lots of costly and risky symptoms of the choices we've made where we have picked a particular system component and have innovated specifically to maximize the yield of that particular system component. In short, lots of energy moving through a system that can't handle it, lots of consequences, but this is a whack-a-mole game, whacking down one of those, quote, problems as if it is the only problem in sight without a correct diagnosis of the origin of that problem is probably a worse idea than ignoring it. And there's evidence to back that up. And so we have, at the beginning of the 21st century, the possibility of an accurate diagnosis. With that brings many frontiers for innovation that have not been squarely in sight, all of which, one way or the other, anchor in the recognition that we are always, and farmers always have been, innovating in and managing systems for a wide array of outcomes across time, across space, across categories. So one message that I think is extremely important for this audience and for all audiences is when we think about food systems, we're always thinking about water systems and energy systems. So critical infrastructure related to our provisioning demands is really the focus. And agriculture, without a doubt, is not only the means by which we provision ourselves with energy, but it is also clearly the dominant way we take care of our planet. And again, we have never innovated with those two clear purposes in sight at scale. Now, farmers have been doing this for millennia, and you heard many examples of that commitment, that obvious commitment to the resources by which farming operations are sustained. So we hear a lot these days about agriculture or food, water, energy nexus. And I would suggest any comprehensive food policy has to, and I'm sure would in this audience, be undertaken in light of this nexus. And in fact, it's interesting to me, and why this relationship with the Department of Energy is so important, is the currencies in which we may end up translating across those different systems are likely to be, among other things, energy. And so, welcome to the era in which these choices we make in our food systems, from the smallest possible scales to the global scale, couldn't be more important. The Anthropocene era, a new geological era in which our species influences the physical conditions in which we will live going forward. The Earth will not be the same. Well, many of you in this room have been on this subject for a long time. You were those pioneering voices. You have been those frontier farmers pushing your systems in the directions you felt were the right ways. But the scale of our consequences, the connectedness of our world, has brought our discussions, your discussions, into central focus from other communities that haven't necessarily been tracking the consequences of food systems. This is a report that was published March of 2014 by the actuary at Lloyd's of London, who's responsible for risk exposure. This is a landmark publication because it brings our topics squarely into central focus for those communities that, among other things, value risk, systematically, objectively, rigorously value risk, and increasingly are using words like resilience. So food insecurity is a significant risk to global society. It's a significant risk to global business. And your insurers are watching. Clearly, food security and safety issues create lots of different kinds of dynamics, some of them potentially quite positive in terms of opening up new markets. And in any case, major global policy dialogues are underway to socialize systemic risk originating in food systems, and furthermore, and this is where technology becomes important, to build the vocabulary, to build the rigorous practice we're going to need to quantify those risks, to test our ability to see and characterize and manage those risks. So technology can pull back the curtains on these systems. Technology can test our ability to see these systems and to steer them. How many of you recognize this picture? This is a picture that has to do with transparency in food systems. This is a picture that's in many social studies textbooks, coming from the early part of the 19th century in the UK, when there was a move to abolish slavery. This is a picture, so this is transparency, of slaves in the slave hold of a slaving ship carrying sugar. The tactic to abolish slavery involved sneaking on the slave ship and pulling back the curtain with respect to the conditions the human beings subjected to that trade experienced. As a consequence of pictures like this and similar insights, a sugar boycott went into effect in the early part of the 19th century, resulting really very quickly in the abolition of the importation of slaves in the UK. Transparency makes huge change, and this is a food system story. So, The question with transparency is, can we transition from being smart, clever, fast, to being wiser with respect to the choices we make? Because the consequences of those choices have huge impacts for us today, locally, regionally, nationally, and globally. I'd argue we have a lot to learn about this. I often draw from health analogies. It's a heavily invested field. Some might argue quite a bit ahead of the way we think, at least of where health is an inescapable topic. And so I think it's instructive to just take a look at events in the last few weeks, because all that technology didn't keep a person exposed from Ebola who said he'd been exposed from Ebola and had recently returned from a region with Ebola in the hospital. So a default to technology is not wise. So I'm going to just take a minute to expand on this topic of transparency, because it's been really significant in my journey as a plant breeder. I met this woman. Her name is Elinor Ostrom. She won the Nobel Prize in 2009. And Elinor Ostrom heard me worrying as someone with various types of responsibilities about data and research and analytics. She heard me worrying about this. And we were at that time worried about information infrastructure for sustainability science. And she said, actually, if we understand that it's not just about information, it's about human decision making. And human decision making belongs inside the system, not outside the system in that old-fashioned push the pipeline of information out. Then we aren't talking about information infrastructure. We're talking about something she calls the knowledge system. And in a knowledge system, transparency is fundamentally important. But it is not just about lots of objective information. It's about bringing human decision-making into relationship with that information. Under the lens of sustainability, virtually anything I can think of becomes a common pool resource. And our ability to manage those common pool resources, whether it's your health or my diet or your water or food security in another country, our ability to manage those challenges becomes our opportunity, our shared opportunity, as well as our shared threat. This particular woman focused on governance. And so I want to circle back to a comment Kathleen Merrigan made this morning, because governance of natural resources then becomes really central. And I'm just betting that in systems where women have strong roles in governance of those natural resources, we will see outcomes that better achieve a whole array of goals. And that's a testable assertion. Furthermore, based on this thinking, there is a concept that I think is really important for us to consider, and that is, who are the takers? Who are the takers? We have a lot to learn about this question. In some sense, we're all the takers because we're borrowing all that lovely fossil energy. We're using that with wild abandon. I was thinking this morning and yesterday that if I were to show this caricature of a fight, most of the people in the room, except those perhaps who control major global food supply chains, would see themselves as David. Although you're not all the same David. And it is a caricature. And so I think one thing transparency can do is invite us beyond the caricatures. Lynn Ostrom said to me in the science community, she said, but don't ever forget, you're building for a fight. And here's what I know about objective information and fights. The more we have, the more objective information we have about the fights, the shorter the fight on average, the better quality the fight, the more it's about what it's about and not that I hate your grandfather. And furthermore, the more the outcomes of those fights better balance my needs and your needs now and later. In other words, sustainability. And so in my world today, I see some interesting juxtapositions. For example, defense technologies coming out of the longest war are being civilianized. We have a long history of doing this, radar, weather, etc. But these technologies are being applied, for example, in food supply chains to take a look at human trafficking through the ways in which we move materials across the planet. These technologies are being used to track our use of natural resources in real time. And these technologies offer the possibility of being very disruptive. So what can we learn from systems engineers? Maybe not what you think. Incremental advances in wildly unbalanced systems can be dangerous and expensive. So continuous improvement, while it certainly has taught us an incredible amount, has also taught us that that's not enough. And reimagining, re-envisioning these systems, food systems and the ways in which they nest in other critical systems is going to be extremely important. Systems engineers use words like resilience, flexibility, redundancy, and regeneration. And so do our farmers. So I want to close by just highlighting some of the things I learned from farmers. The invitation for all of us, particularly those connected to technology and innovation, is how do we systematize these anecdotes? I didn't say scale up, did I? I said, how do we systematize these anecdotes? And we have before us communities all around this country, all around the world that are doing that already. So I'm going to show a colleague in North Dakota. It's great that Fred is from there. These are colleagues that farm for soil health. I view them as lessons in positive deviance. That's a public health strategy where if you want to know why people live long, you go to the long-lived populations. These guys have focused on soil and soil health for generations, probably. They have incredibly complex systems. You got to see an example. Klaus is another, and Mary Howell are another example of farmers that know the obvious. If your soil's healthy, your farm's probably healthy. These are diverse, really highly tuned systems. When it rains, their soils absorb a lot more water. They stay put. This man, Gabe Brown, made his county corn average in 2012 when many of his neighbors who had farmed in other ways were wiped out. And so the last point I want to make is that soils are space of this century. We have barely brought into sight, and certainly I really don't understand many of the ways in which beneficial interactions related to the soil and the way our food systems work can yield benefits of many different types. So I want to just mention that I'm seeing consequences of these insights broadly. These are two former students of mine. They came to Cornell University to study plant breeding and be reductionist scientists and plant breeders and save the world like I did. And instead, they're entrepreneurs and their medium is information. We may see people designing completely unfamiliar production systems. Very interesting possibilities. So one of the places I got a degree is MIT, and I'm getting called back there all the time. They're a land grant school, but not an ag school, last I knew, and I have a lot to offer. But to close down, the commitment for me is to learn how to see the outcomes and the impacts of our choices individually and collectively on human systems, landscapes, conflict, health. And I am seeing radical collaborations between people who make each other so uncomfortable, collaborations between parts of the world that would never have connected physically or any other way. And collaborations to begin to define our terms for this century and our management of food systems. So the last point I'm going to make is vocabulary. I started with vocabulary. I'm going to finish with vocabulary. We don't have the vocabulary to have these conversations with much sophistication. Indicators related to outcomes we care about, sustainability, health, whatever they may be, become our vocabulary. This is a slide a good friend of mine at Columbia University's Earth Institute gave me, showing the difference, the yellow line at the top and the red line at the bottom, between effective indicators and indicators that don't synthesize well the conditions. So bad air, very tough thing to describe systematically. And as a consequence, that yellow line shows from 2000 to 2013 or so what's happened with one global reflection of air pollution. Bad water, it's much easier to describe. And when we have the ability to describe the condition of a resource accurately through time, while we may fight about it, we will fight about it, Elinor Ostrom told me we would, we can drive those conversations the way we all need them to go. So there's Bono and Jesse Helms arm wrestling over I'm not sure what, but, but at a discussion of what our Millennium Development Goals will be, and our Sustainable Development Goals are being set as we speak for the 10 years ahead. So roles for technology in the 21st century, I'm going to suggest all of us in this room, all of us, are looking for healthy systems in balance at the nexus. We don't know what those words mean yet with a great deal of sophistication, but we certainly have some ideas. Those ideas are testable. Those ideas are at work across the world. And I'll conclude with a comment made by a colleague from whom I've learned a great deal. He's at the College of Menominee Nation in Wisconsin. I invited him to be on a USDA committee that oversees the science investments, and we brought him to Washington and showed him the fabulous science that was going on across the department. And he was very quiet for about a day and a half, which is not that usual. And so I sat down next to him and I said, "What do you think?" And he looked at me, long pause, and he said, "This is a pretty different ethos from where I come from. Seems pretty clear to me. We need to learn to live well within our means." So we, the human family, are asking with humility some really powerful and important questions about the kind of future we want and the ways in which our choices in food systems set those courses from the smallest to the largest scales. Technology enables us to see in new ways, but it'll be up to us to negotiate what we do with what we see. Thank you.